In 1943, deep inside the industrial heart of Germany, a new kind of machine was being born, not in triumph, not in confidence, but in desperation. The Reich was running out of time. The war that had begun as a storm of conquest was turning into a slow, grinding avalanche. The Red Army was advancing westward. Allied bombers were darkening German skies. And on every front, Hitler's armoured spearheads, the symbol of Blitzkrieg itself, were beginning to dull. The Panzer divisions, once unstoppable, were bleeding steel. Thousands of tanks lost in the snows of Russia, the sands of North Africa, and the hedgerows of France. Every loss hurt, not just militarily, but symbolically. Hitler's Germany had defined itself through engineering, through its belief that technical perfection could bend the world to its will. And now, that same faith was cracking under the pressure of reality. Among the clutter of rulers, compasses, and blueprints, German engineers were sketching out a solution. A weapon that could restore the balance. A machine that could kill from miles away, strike without warning, and stand unbreakable before Allied guns. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They called it the Jagdpanther, the hunting panther. It was not a tank in the traditional sense. It carried no turret, no rotating gun. Its weapon was fixed into the hull, giving it a low, predatory profile. But the absence of a turret wasn't a flaw, it was a philosophy. Germany's armoured doctrine had begun to shift. The Reich no longer had the resources to produce vast numbers of tanks. Instead, it sought quality over quantity. A smaller number of elite tank destroyers, built for ambush and annihilation. The idea was brutally simple. Let the enemy come, then kill him from concealment before he even saw you. Jagdpanther prototype rolling out of a hangar. The first prototype rolled out in late 1943, an angular monster of welded armour and lethal precision. The engineers had taken the proven Panther chassis and mounted upon it the 88mm PaK-43 cannon, the same weapon that had already made the Tiger tank a legend. The result was a paradox: part Panther, part Tiger, part nightmare. On paper, it was perfect. Sloped armour for deflection. A gun that could punch through a Sherman or a Churchill from over 2 kilometers away. Mobility superior to the lumbering Tiger. And a silhouette so low it could vanish behind a ridge and strike like an assassin. The Wehrmacht generals, the Waffen-SS officers, even Hitler himself were entranced. It looked unstoppable. But beneath that confidence lay the same fatal flaw that would doom so much of German engineering in the war: perfection pursued without practicality. The Jagdpanther wasn't designed to fight a long war. It was designed to win a perfect one. And by 1944, Germany wasn't fighting a perfect war anymore. The Panther tank itself had been born out of crisis, the shocking defeat at Kursk in 1943. The Soviet T-34, with its sloped armour and wide tracks, had humiliated the German Panzers. The Panther was the German answer: faster, stronger, deadlier. But it came with a price. The Panther's engine, the Maybach HL-230, was powerful but delicate. It overheated easily, leaked oil, and required constant maintenance. Its gearbox, designed for 45 tons, was always on the edge of failure. Still, it was a marvel of design for its time. Then came the Tiger, the armoured idol of Nazi propaganda. With its massive Kabuki-36 gun, it terrified Allied crews from North Africa to the Eastern Front. But the Tiger was too heavy, too complex, too slow to produce in numbers. So, when German High Command demanded a new tank destroyer, engineers were ordered to merge the Panther's speed with the Tiger's gun. It sounded logical. It looked beautiful. It was also a ticking mechanical time bomb. The Panther's chassis wasn't meant to carry the full stress of the 88mm cannon's recoil. Its suspension strained under the weight. The front drive sprockets wore out faster than expected, and its transmission, already fragile, was pushed to its limits. In testing, the prototype could hit 45 kilometers per hour on level ground, but add mud, hills, and the chaos of combat, and that number dropped fast. German test reports from early 1944 recorded frequent breakdowns after only a few dozen kilometers. Gear teeth sheared off. Final drives overheated. Reversing uphill? Often impossible. To the engineers, these were solvable problems. To the soldiers waiting at the front, they were death sentences. By mid-1944, Hitler demanded 500 Jagdpanthers for the coming defense of France. He believed they could stop the Allied invasion before it even began. Factories in MIAG, MNH, and Maschinenfabrik Niedersachsen-Hanover began working day and night. But Allied bombing raids constantly disrupted production. Steel shipments were delayed, engines arrived incomplete, and crews were rushed through training. Still, propaganda films hailed the Jagdpanther as a symbol of German technological superiority. Insert archival reel: smiling mechanics wiping oil from the hull, an officer inspecting the gun barrel, a voiceover boasting of Germany's newest wonder weapon. To the outside world, it was the perfect predator. To the men building it, it was barely holding together. Scene transition: an engineer's notebook, grease-stained, with penciled sketches and notes in German. Kraftübertragung unzuverlässig, power transmission unreliable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That note appears again and again in surviving records. The transmission couldn't handle the torque of the gun, the armor combined. And because Germany was running short of high-quality steel alloys, replacement parts wore out twice as fast. Every Jagdpanther that rolled off the line carried the same flaw hidden under its sleek armor. Unlike the Allies, who prioritized flexibility and logistics, German tank doctrine still worshipped the idea of decisive confrontation, a perfect ambush, a single, overwhelming strike. So, the Jagdpanther was built for one thing: offensive firepower in a defensive shell. It had no machine gun on its roof for close infantry defense until late versions added one. It had limited vision ports, making it almost blind in close quarters. And its gun, fixed forward, required the entire tank to turn to aim something that worked in open terrain, but became a nightmare in cities or forests. The engineers knew it, the crews knew it, but there was no time to redesign. Hitler wanted results. The Jagdpanther was not a weapon of necessity, it was a weapon of ideology. A machine born from the belief that technology alone could rewrite reality. Cut to a scene of German officers in field caps, inspecting tanks on a muddy testing ground. In March 1944, the first operational Jagdpanther units, Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 654, received their vehicles. The crews were impressed by the power of the gun, the precision of its optics, and the thick, sloped armor that shrugged off Allied shells. But within days, the breakdowns began. Engines overheated. Gearboxes failed. Electrical systems shorted. One report from the Western Front recorded that more Jagdpanthers were disabled by mechanical failure than by enemy fire. Still, German propaganda called it the perfect tank destroyer. By mid-1944, the world around the Jagdpanther was collapsing. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was sweeping through Belarus. Fuel was scarce, spare parts rarer still. Each Jagdpanther that reached the front was precious, a symbol of what German industry could still produce despite the bombing, the shortages, the chaos. To German soldiers, it was both a promise and a curse. They admired it, they feared losing it, and they dreaded having to fix it. A single damaged gearbox could immobilize it for days. A broken track, and the entire 80-ton vehicle had to be abandoned. Even recovering it required another tank, and the Germans no longer had many to spare. Narrator, quoting post-war interview, "When we first saw one, we thought it was a tiger. Big, low, mean-looking thing. The gun barrel looked like it could shoot through a house. But then we noticed it wasn't moving, just sitting there, quiet, like it had scared itself to death. Sergeant Bill Redding, 3rd Armoured Division. The Allies, by 1944, had learned the opposite lesson. The M4 Sherman, often mocked by German propaganda, was simple, reliable, and easy to repair. For every Jagdpanther the Germans built, the Allies built 30 Shermans. For every hour a German crew spent fighting, they spent 3 repairing. The Jagdpanther may have had superior armour and firepower, but wars are not won on blueprints. They're won on logistics, adaptability, and numbers. Still, to the German crews who fought in them, the Jagdpanther was a machine to be respected. They loved its accuracy. They loved its killing power. They just wished it would last longer than a week without breaking down. As the months wore on, production quality fell further. Welding became sloppy. Paint was applied hastily. Components were mismatched between factories, but the obsession with perfection never faded. Engineers continued to submit requests for improved optics, stronger transmissions, new types of tracks. None of these could be fulfilled in time. By the end of 1944, less than 400 Jagdpanthers had been produced. Many never even reached the battlefield. Those that did became like ghosts appearing suddenly, destroying their targets, then vanishing again. Sometimes not, because of cunning or tactics, but because they'd broken down before they could retreat. It was a machine that embodied Germany's greatest contradiction: the pursuit of ultimate strength built upon a foundation of weakness. Visual transition. Black and white photo of a Jagdpanther abandoned in a forest clearing, tracks buried in mud. Every bolt, every weld, every elegant curve of its sloped armour told the same story. Of engineers who could design miracles, but not miracles that could last. The Jagdpanther was the last true expression of the German belief in mechanical supremacy, a weapon designed not merely to kill, but to prove something to themselves, to the world, to history. But history doesn't care about perfection. It cares about endurance. Soft orchestral rise, imagery fades to slow montage of assembly lines, tank crews, and fields littered with destroyed armour. By the spring of 1944, the Jagdpanther stood ready for battle. Its builders called it unstoppable. Its crews called it beautiful, and in the months ahead, they would discover that both were wrong. Fade to black. When the Jagdpanther first appeared in the hedgerows of Normandy, no one on the Allied side knew exactly what they were facing. British tank crews reported that a new Tiger type had been seen near Caen, its low profile and sharply sloped armour glinting through the morning fog. To the men inside their Shermans and Cromwells, it looked like another step in the German obsession with building the perfect killing machine, something that could annihilate from a distance, shrug off, return fire, and then melt back into the tree line before anyone could react. But to the German crew inside the steel shell, the first days of combat were a blend of awe and frustration. They were driving what many engineers in Berlin called the most elegant piece of armoured design the Reich had ever produced. Yet, even as it rolled forward to its baptism of fire, they could feel the strain beneath their boots, the vibration of metal that whispered something was already going wrong. It was July 1944. The Western Front was collapsing under Allied weight. After weeks of fierce resistance, the German lines around Caen were a shredded mixture of armoured remnants, exhausted infantry, and burning vehicles. Into that chaos arrived the first operational Jagdpanthers, roughly a dozen vehicles from Schwer Panzerjägerabteilung 654, rushed into action straight from the factories at Mielau. They were still learning the quirks of their new weapon. The crews had trained hastily, some transitioning from Nashorns or Marders, and they quickly discovered that the Jagdpanther's beauty came with a cost. Its massive 88mm gun, the same high-velocity cannon that terrified aircrews and tankers alike, made the vehicle nose-heavy. The engine, an overworked Maybach HL 230, groaned under the added stress. and the transmission, a lightly modified version of the Panthers, was already notorious among mechanics for needing careful coaxing rather than brute force. But the men didn't complain. They had seen what that gun could do. They believed in its killing power. The first engagement came outside a small Norman village, Saint-Martin-de-Bienfait. The morning mist clung to the fields, and British units from the 11th Armoured Division were probing forward, their Shermans moving cautiously through the bocage. From a concealed position behind a hedgerow, a single Jagdpanther lay in wait. The commander peered through his periscope, eyes narrowing as he spotted movement between the apple trees. The loader held his breath. The gunner adjusted his sight to 1,200 metres. Fewer. The 88mm thundered. The recoil slammed through the hull, the round punched through the lead Sherman, and within seconds it erupted in a plume of black smoke. Before the sound even died, another shot followed. A second tank burst into flames. Panic rippled through the British column. Some reversed frantically, others tried to swing their turrets toward the invisible threat. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The German commander's voice cut through the intercom. Zwei Treffer, both destroyed. His crew smiled grimly. The machine had done its job, swift, precise, terrifying. But when the order came to move, the smile faded. The battalion command radio crackled. Pull back artillery incoming. The driver engaged reverse, but the vehicle hesitated. The gearbox groaned. The machine jerked, then stopped. The commander repeated the order, voice rising. The driver tried again. Metal screeched, and smoke began to seep from the engine compartment. The Jagdpanther was heavy, almost 80 tons when fully loaded, and the field they were in was slightly sloped. The Maybach engine struggled, the torque ratio on reverse gear too low to lift the mass uphill. For precious seconds they were motionless, the entire tank shuddering under its own strain. Then the commander swore, ordering forward motion instead. The Jagdpanther lurched out of hiding, tearing through a fence, engine howling, as British shells began to land nearby. The crew didn't yet understand that they had just encountered the flaw that would haunt the Jagdpanther for the rest of the war, a flaw buried deep in its mechanical soul. That night, after the engagement, they set up camp behind a line of trees. The driver sat on the hull, wiping grease from his hands. "She's strong," he muttered, "but she doesn't like going backward." The mechanic from the maintenance platoon, inspecting the transmission, nodded silently. He had seen it before, with the Panther's clutch plates that overheated, gears that ground down under pressure. The Jagdpanther was supposed to be an improvement. Better suspension, better armour, better everything. Yet here they were, stalled on a gentle incline because the engine couldn't provide enough reverse torque to counter gravity. It wasn't just a mechanical issue, it was a design philosophy. German tanks were built for attack, not retreat. Every component, from the forward gear ratios to the slope of the glacis plate, embodied an assumption: the machine would always advance, never withdraw. In 1944, that belief had become a dangerous illusion. Over the following weeks, the Jagdpanthers of Abteilung 654 were thrown into one desperate defence after another. In ambushes, they were almost unbeatable. A single vehicle could halt an entire column, destroying Shermans and Cromwells long before they could return fire. Allied tankers learned to fear the sudden echoing crack of the 88mm, the flash that seemed to come from nowhere. But every time the Germans tried to reposition, to move between engagements or retreat under artillery fire, disaster followed. Transmissions failed, engines overheated, clutches burned out. Some crews abandoned their machines after minor mechanical breakdowns, simply because there were no spare parts or recovery vehicles left to pull them free. The Jagdpanther, as lethal as it was, became a stationary weapon, a bunker on tracks. Reports began to filter back to the German High Command. Commanders praised the gun and the armour, but their maintenance logs told another story. Frequent gearbox failures under reverse load. One report from the Normandy front read, Another noted that several vehicles had to be destroyed by their own crews after breaking down in minor terrain obstacles. Yet in propaganda reels, the Jagdpanther was hailed as an unstoppable weapon, the spear of German armour. Soldiers at the front watched those newsreels with bitter smiles. They had seen the truth. It was indeed unstoppable, until it had to stop itself. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence was taking notice. After the first reports of new German tank destroyers, captured documents began to surface, describing the Jagdpanther's specifications. British and American analysts were impressed. The combination of thick sloped armour and the 88mm Park 43 gun made it a theoretical masterpiece. But by late summer 1944, field reports were also coming in enemy tanks abandoned intact, often on gentle slopes or muddy roads, engines intact, but transmissions seized. One British officer wrote in his diary, "They build them too fine, a perfect sword that shatters if swung too hard." It was a phrase that would come to define the Allies' perception of late-war German engineering. For the crews inside these machines, however, the myth was harder to let go. They loved the Jagdpanther's precision. When it worked like nothing else. One veteran, interviewed years later, remembered the strange pride he felt during those chaotic weeks. "We were few, always outnumbered, but when I fired that gun, I felt like I held the line of history itself. Then the engine failed, and we had to walk home." His laugh was hollow. They had come to trust the machine more than commanders, and when the machine betrayed them, it was as if the war itself had turned its back. The battle for Normandy ended in catastrophe for the Germans. The encirclement at Falaise destroyed what was left of their armoured strength in the west. Among the wreckage were several Jagdpanthers, some burned out, others sitting eerily intact, their guns elevated, tracks still aligned, but engines silent. American and Canadian soldiers approached them cautiously, expecting booby traps. When none were found, they climbed inside, fascinated by the craftsmanship. The smell of oil and smoke hung thick in the air. The interiors were cramped but clean, meticulously built, instruments labelled with neat German precision. Yet almost every vehicle shared the same issue: the transmission jammed, the gears stripped, or the reverse drive simply locked. For Allied engineers, it was a revelation. For German industry, it was an embarrassment too costly to fix. In those last days of the Normandy campaign, the Jagdpanther became a symbol of contradiction. It represented everything the German military once stood for: precision, perfection, ruthless efficiency, and everything it could no longer sustain. There was brilliance in its design, yes, but also blindness. The same nation that once valued adaptability and improvisation now worshipped technical purity at the expense of practicality. Each machine that failed in the mud of Normandy was a testament to that arrogance. The crews who burned or fled from their crippled vehicles carried that bitter truth with them, retreating on foot through the fields where their steel beasts had died. By September, the survivors of Abteilung 654 were regrouping inside Germany. They had lost more tanks to mechanical breakdowns than to enemy fire. Replacement parts were scarce. Many crews began cannibalizing their own vehicles just to keep a few running. And yet, they still believed in the Jagdpanther's myth that one flawless ambush could change everything, that the next engagement might redeem the design. But war had moved past them. The Allied advance was relentless, their supply lines efficient, their tactics adaptive. Against that kind of momentum, even the most beautiful machine was just another relic waiting to be abandoned on the roadside. Looking back, the Jagdpanther's first combat in Normandy was both its triumph and its tragedy. In a single campaign, it proved its lethality and exposed its flaw. Its armour saved lives, its gun destroyed enemies, its engineering doomed itself. It was, in every sense, the perfect German machine, magnificent in theory, fragile in reality. When American tankers would later encounter one intact on the road to Cologne, they would marvel at its lines and curse its mechanics. never realizing that this contradiction had already played out months earlier in the fields of France. The Jagdpanther was a hunter that could not retreat, a masterpiece that could not survive the weight of the war it was built to win. In the winter of 1943, the German High Command stood on the edge of delusion and desperation. On the surface, their armies still occupied vast stretches of Europe, from the beaches of France to the borders of the Soviet Union. But deep inside the armoured heart of the Wehrmacht, something had changed. The confidence that had carried the Panzerwaffe from victory to victory was cracking. For the first time, German commanders were forced to admit that their tanks, the pride of the Reich, were no longer the undisputed rulers of the battlefield. The Tiger and Panther, once symbols of technological supremacy, were breaking down faster than they could be built. Each new design promised perfection. Each one came with a flaw that would reveal itself too late. It was during those dark months, when the smoke from Kursk still hung over the Eastern Front, that a new idea began to take shape, an armoured vehicle so powerful that it could restore the lost balance, one shot at a time. They called it the Jagdpanther, the hunting panther. It was to be the next evolution of Germany's armoured philosophy. Take the best parts of existing machines, strip away the turret, reinforce the armour, and mount the deadliest anti-tank gun ever fielded. It would be the perfect predator, fast enough to move between ambush positions, armoured enough to shrug off Allied shells, and armed with a weapon capable of killing anything that rolled toward it. On paper, it was flawless. On the battlefield, it would expose the fatal logic of German engineering, the belief that perfection could overcome practicality, that design could replace strategy. The story of the Jagdpanther began, inevitably, with failure. The Panther tank, which had entered service in 1943, was supposed to be Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34. It combined sloped armour with high speed and a powerful 75mm gun, and on the drawing board, it was everything Hitler wanted, a tank that could dominate both East and West. But the Panther's first appearances in battle were disasters. During the opening days of Operation Citadel, the great tank offensive at Kursk, over half of the Panthers broke down before even reaching the front. Engines caught fire, transmissions failed, final drives shattered. German engineers scrambled to fix the problems, but they could not change the reality that their machines were becoming too complex for the war they were fighting. The Panther was a masterpiece, but it was fragile and fragility was fatal. Still, the 75mm gun wasn't enough. Soviet armour was growing thicker, and on the Western Front, reports from France and Italy told of new Allied designs, Shermans fitted with high-velocity guns, British Fireflies, and American tank destroyers that could match German vehicles at long range. The Germans needed something to restore their edge, something that could kill at a distance without needing to expose itself. The idea of the Jagdpanther came from this desperation. If the Panther was too fragile and the Tiger too heavy, then perhaps combining their best qualities could produce the ultimate weapon. Engineers at MIAG and MNH, the same factories building Panthers, began drawing blueprints. They removed the turret to save weight, welded a massive casemate on top, and mounted the long-barreled 88mm PaK-43 gun inside. The result looked elegant, a low, angular silhouette that seemed designed for ambush. Its armour sloped like a single blade of steel cutting through the battlefield. The 88mm gun was already legendary. It was the same weapon that had terrified Allied aircrews and shattered Soviet armour. The PaK-43 was capable of penetrating over 200mm of steel at 1,000 metres, enough to destroy any Allied tank before it came within firing range. In comparison, a Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't even scratch the Jagdpanther's front at that distance. German designers boasted that the new vehicle would be unstoppable. But hidden beneath that confidence were compromises that would prove catastrophic. The Jagdpanther weighed nearly 70 tons, far more than the Panther's original suspension and gearbox were designed to handle. The Maybach HL-230 engine, already pushed to its limits, now had to move an even heavier machine through mud, snow, and bombed-out terrain. To save production time, They kept the Panther's transmission and final drives components that had been failing since the first days of Kursk. It was like taking the heart of a sprinter and transplanting it into the body of a weightlifter. It worked, but only for a while. In December 1943, the first prototype rolled out for testing at Kummersdorf. Observers described it as imposing, silent, and eerily smooth as it glided across the proving ground. When it fired, the recoil shook the earth, but the test drivers complained of the same familiar problems. The gears jammed, the steering clutches overheated, and the reverse drive was painfully weak. Engineers dismissed these issues as minor, promising they could be fixed during production. They didn't realize that those small mechanical imperfections would become fatal when multiplied by the chaos of real combat. In war, a tank that couldn't reverse was a tank that couldn't survive. By early 1944, Hitler personally approved the Jagdpanther for production, declaring it the best tank destroyer in the world. He loved the name, the symbolism, the sheer audacity of its design. To him, it was proof that German engineering could still outthink and outbuild the Allies. But the reality in the factories told a different story. The Allied bombing campaign had already crippled Germany's industrial heartland. Steel deliveries were late, skilled workers were scarce, and assembly lines were constantly interrupted by air raids. Each Jagdpanther took weeks to complete, and many left the factory with parts scavenged, from wrecked vehicles. Quality control was nearly impossible. Some were delivered with mismatched components, others with transmissions that had already been repaired multiple times before even leaving the plant. Yet, on the production sheets sent to Berlin, every single one was marked combat ready. In training, crews immediately noticed the contradictions of their new weapon. It was deadly in ambush but slow to reposition. The 88mm gun could pierce anything, but its limited traverse meant the entire vehicle had to turn to aim an exhausting task for a 70-ton machine. And while its armour could shrug off most Allied rounds, the sides and rear remained vulnerable. The men nicknamed it the front-line bunker. It could dominate any engagement as long as it didn't have to move. The design itself was undeniably elegant. The front armour, angled at 55 degrees, was 80mm thick. The glacis could deflect even high-velocity rounds. Inside, the gunner sat beside a sophisticated sighting system that allowed precise targeting up to 2 kilometers. The crew compartment, though cramped, was lined with smooth welds and labelled dials. Every surface reflected the German obsession with precision, the idea that war could be reduced to geometry and mechanics. Yet beneath that perfection, the same old ghost lurked: the Panther's flawed transmission, the weak reverse gear, the fragile final drives. The men on the front would discover those ghosts soon enough. To understand why the Jagdpanther existed, one must understand the mindset of its creators. By late 1943, the German war machine was no longer fighting for victory, it was fighting for prestige. Each new weapon was as much a psychological statement as a tactical one. The Reich's engineers believed that if they could create a perfect machine, they could somehow reverse the tide of the war. This belief bordered on mysticism. They spoke of steel as though it had spirit, of engines as if they were living beings. The Jagdpanther was the embodiment of that faith, a technological cathedral built in the ruins of a collapsing empire. But the war had changed. The Allies no longer fought on German terms. They had learned to overwhelm perfection with quantity, to replace lost machines faster than the Germans could fix theirs. In 1940, the Germans had outnumbered their enemies in quality. By 1944, the Allies outnumbered them in everything that mattered. Against that tide, even the most sophisticated tank was just another target waiting to be destroyed or abandoned. The Jagdpanther's creation, therefore, was less an act of strategy than of denial, a refusal to accept that the age of decisive technology had ended. When the first Jagdpanthers rolled toward the front in early 1944, they were not greeted with cheers. Mechanics shook their heads, logisticians cursed their weight, and the soldiers who would soon drive them stared in awe and apprehension. They admired its power but distrusted its fragility. "It's beautiful," one driver wrote in a letter home, but it feels like a beast that doesn't want to move. That sentence captured the essence of German engineering in 1944, a paradox of strength and weakness, beauty and futility. At headquarters, the generals spoke of how the Jagdpanther would restore balance to the front. They believed that its ability to kill any Allied tank at long range would give German units the chance to delay, regroup, and strike back. But on the ground, the truth was harsher. The fuel shortages were crippling, the roads were cratered, spare parts were non-existent. Each Jagdpanther that broke down was often left where it stood, too heavy to tow, too valuable to repair. Crews learned to travel in pairs not for tactical support, but so one could tow the other when, inevitably, it failed. Still, despite everything, there was pride. The Jagdpanther's crews believed they were part of something special. They were the last of the old elite, the inheritors of the Panzerwaffe's legacy. Even as the Reich crumbled around them, they maintained the rituals, polishing optics, aligning sights, keeping their vehicles immaculate. They were fighting not just for Germany, but for the idea of German engineering itself. They knew the war was being lost, but as long as the 88mm roared, they could still believe in the illusion of control. When Allied tankers later encountered the Jagdpanther, their reactions mirrored those of the men who built it. They were awed by its design, stunned by its firepower, and confused by its failures. It looked perfect from the outside, smooth, purposeful, deadly. But inside, it was a story of exhaustion, compromise, and decline. Each weld told of missing materials, each broken gear told of time running out. It was a machine built in the image of a dying empire, magnificent, doomed, and unaware of its own fragility. The irony was almost poetic. The Germans had set out to create the ultimate hunter, but in doing so, they had built a trap for themselves. The Jagdpanther's brilliance was inseparable from its weakness. It was too heavy to maneuver, too complex to maintain, too few to matter, and yet it inspired awe among enemies and allies alike. To the soldiers who faced it in Normandy, it seemed like a relic from another age, a monster that didn't belong to the world of mud and attrition. To the men who drove it, it was both a source of pride and a burden too heavy to bear. By the time it reached the Western Front, the Jagdpanther was already a legend in German propaganda, the unstoppable hunter that would turn the tide. But in truth, it was born from panic and built in haste. It carried the best gun in Europe, but the heart of a machine that could barely sustain it. It was the perfect metaphor for Germany in 1944, a nation still capable of brilliance, still dreaming of dominance, yet slowly strangled by its own perfectionism. In the end, the Jagdpanther was not the triumph of German engineering, it was its requiem. When the war finally rolled over the Siegfried Line and into the heart of Germany, the American tankers who stumbled upon the abandoned Jagdpanther near Cologne thought they had found a miracle. It sat alone by the roadside, its camouflage still sharp, its barrel aimed skyward as if frozen mid-command. The tracks were intact, no shell holes, no visible damage. It looked like a beast waiting for orders. The GIs approached cautiously, weapons raised, no movement. The hatch was open. Inside, the smell of burnt oil and metal filled the air. It was quiet, too quiet for a machine that had once breathed fire. The crew had fled or been captured, but the vehicle itself looked untouched. It hadn't been destroyed, it had simply died standing still. When the ordnance engineers arrived, they treated it like a fallen monument. They had heard stories about the Jagdpanther, a machine capable of knocking out an Allied tank before it could return fire, the deadliest ambusher of the war. Now, for the first time, they could study it up close. The men circled it slowly, running their hands over the thick sloped armour, examining the welds, the smoothness of the gun mount, the quality of the optics. It was beautiful in its own cold way, a machine designed not just to kill, but to embody an idea. Even in silence, it looked confident. One American sergeant, climbing onto the hull, tapped it twice and muttered, "Hell, This thing looks like it could still fight. But when they tried to move it, they learned why it hadn't escaped. The engine refused to turn over. The transmission was locked. When the mechanics finally pried open the access panels, they found the clutch plates fused solid and the reverse gear stripped clean. It hadn't been hit by a shell, it had been defeated by its own design. The inspection that followed was methodical. The Americans photographed every angle, took measurements, noted serial numbers. They were impressed by the 88mm gun long, elegant and deadly, even by 1945 standards. They marveled at the precision of the optics, at how finely machined each piece of metal was. "These guys built tanks like watches," one engineer said. "Trouble is, you can't take a watch through mud." When they opened the gearbox, the admiration turned to disbelief. The transmission was nearly identical to that of the Panther, a system that had caused endless trouble since 1943. The gears were too fine, the tolerances too tight, and the entire mechanism relied on components that could only be produced under peacetime conditions. It was engineering perfection trapped in a war that demanded imperfection. The reverse gear told the real story. On paper, the Jagdpanther could reach speeds of 45 kilometers per hour. In reverse, it could barely manage 5. Worse, the torque ratio was so low that any attempt to back up an incline placed impossible strain on the clutch. The moment the driver tried to reverse uphill, the gearbox screamed, the plates overheated, and the transmission seized. That was exactly what had happened here. The crew had likely tried to reposition under fire, found themselves unable to move, and abandoned the vehicle before the enemy arrived. No gunfire, no explosions, just mechanical surrender. It was, in its own way, a perfect metaphor for the state of the German war machine. Magnificent when advancing, powerless when forced to retreat. As the inspection continued, a quiet sort of respect filled the air. The Americans were mechanics and engineers too, and they could recognize brilliance even when it came from the enemy. They admired the way the Germans had angled every armor plate to deflect shots, the balance of the gun mount, the care taken to ensure smooth recoil. It was as if the Jagdpanther had been built by men who believed that the machine could make up for human failure that engineering could, redeem a collapsing army. But they also saw the price of that belief. Every gear, every bolt, every overly intricate mechanism spoke of an obsession with perfection that had no place in a war being decided by logistics and adaptability. In the end, the Germans had built a weapon too perfect for the world it was meant to fight in. When the reports were written up and sent back to Allied headquarters, the conclusions were clear. The Jagdpanther was formidable in theory, but fatally flawed in practice. Its gun and armor were superb. Its reliability was catastrophic. An excellent design, one American report read, undermined by impracticality and over-engineering. The irony was not lost on anyone. Germany had built a tank destroyer that could destroy anything except its own limitations. And that irony, once discovered in a field near Cologne, became a quiet lesson for every soldier who touched its cold steel. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the battlefield, but the one built into your own machine. By the time the inspection was finished, the men stood back and looked at the Jagdpanther one last time. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the countryside. It glowed softly, as if the dying light had given it one final breath of dignity. One of the engineers pulled out his notebook and wrote just a single line before closing it. Perfect weapon. Impossible war. Then they walked away, leaving the machine where it stood, a silent monument to a nation that had engineered its own defeat. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.